Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, where I'm going to talk to you about nitrogen management for cotton production in Australia's tropics. My name is Paul Grundy, and I'm with the Department of Primary Industries and the Australian Cotton Industries extension arm, CottonInfo. What I'm going to do today is share with you in this presentation some of the knowledge that has been developed over the last 15 years from research undertaken in Northern Australia about how to best manage nitrogen for cotton production in Australia's tropical regions. Nitrogen management and the optimisation of nitrogen is the major challenge for crop managers growing cotton during Australia's tropical wet season. The reason for this is that the soils on which many of these cotton crops are being grown are inherently low both in organic carbon and nitrogen, and this is because those hot, wet conditions expedite the breakdown of crop residues and other organic components in the soil, converting that to nitrate, and then in that high rainfall environment those nitrates can be readily lost. And what this means in practice is that the cotton crops that we're growing tend to be more dependent on applied fertiliser for that primary source of nitrogen. However, given that the wet season is a high loss environment, the usage of that fertiliser in terms of where and when it's applied needs to be both strategic and tactile to minimise the potential for environmental loss. The primary issue with nitrogen management is the cost of getting it wrong can be very high. Too little nitrogen, as you can see in this photo here, results in lost yield potential. However, you can also have too much nitrogen, resulting in rank growth, exacerbating fruit shedding, which when put together can result in maturity delay for that crop. And then there's also a third possibility, which I tend to think might be the worst situation that you might find yourself in, where you've spent a lot of money applying nitrogen fertiliser to a field, only to have the uptake of that nitrogen affected in some way so that the crop doesn't get what it needs, and then you've ended up with poor yield potential. So after accruing significant costs in growing the crop, you're not achieving the expected yield at the end of the season. Ultimately, it's the variability of rainfall that makes nitrogen management quite challenging in the tropics. For example, if you were to broadcast fertiliser over a field and have a high amount of rainfall, it can be very easily washed off. Alternatively, if you have a very small amount of rain, it may be volatilised after that application's taken place. Even after you manage to incorporate that nitrogen into the soil, whether that be through rainfall, for broadcast fertiliser, or you've managed to get a timed implement into the field, there is then the risk that the product, once it's converted into nitrate, might be leached, particularly in sandy soils, or denitrified due to anaerobic conditions after periods of heavy rainfall. And at times it can just seem that nitrogen is so slippery that this product nearly purposely tries to get away from us in these environments. So when we think about how we might optimise nitrogen management in the tropics, it's useful to think about the relationship between the yield that might be produced and the plant's uptake of nitrogen. In this example here, there was 8 experiments conducted by a good colleague of mine, Stephen Yates, with the CSIRO. He conducted these experiments across 5 different seasons on 2 different soil types using 3 different cotton varieties and in scenarios where you followed different crops, being in this case sugarcane or maize, or simply had a bare fallow. This figure shows the relationship that Steve found between the lint yield produced on the y-axis and the amount of nitrogen taken up by the crop to produce that yield. So this isn't nitrogen applied, this is nitrogen that the crop has taken up and was present within those plants during the season. And what you can see in the relationship that's depicted is that essentially for every bale of cotton lint produced by these crops across all of those different seasons and soil types, etc., that essentially the crop took up 18 kilograms of nitrogen for each of those bales produced. However, that was only part of the story. This graph is the same data, but now you're looking at all of the data points that were collected from those different experiments. And what those data points show is the amount of nitrogen taken up by the plants in each of those experiments. And what you can see, particularly on the side there, where you've got all those data points, is that whilst uptake increased within these plants, and that uptake was the result of higher amounts of fertiliser being applied to those crops, yield did not correspondingly increase. And essentially, those yields to the right-hand side of the line represent nitrogen uptake that was in excess of that season's yield potential for converting that nitrogen into useful pickable yield. And the reason for this response, despite the uptake of additional nitrogen, was that the yields in each of these experiments were limited by other factors, and in this case was cloudiness during March and April when these crops were flowering and filling bowls. And what this demonstrates is the importance of fertilising to the yield potential of your environment that you find yourself in. In this case here, putting on additional nitrogen and even having that plant successfully take that nitrogen up did not convert or result in additional yield because of the radiation limitations of the Burdekin environment. So the take-home message from this slide is that when making nitrogen management decisions, the first thing we need is to have an estimate of what the yield potential of your environment might be, and then fertilising to conditions, because additional nitrogen applied in those situations is unlikely to result in economic yield. So the next part of the equation when thinking about how we can make things more efficient is to consider when the crop itself is taking nitrogen up from the soil. And across each of those experiments that Steve undertook, he found that from about day 30 onwards, crops were taking up 3 to 4 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per day, and this continued till about 90 days after sowing, which more or less coincided with crop cutout. He found that very little nitrogen was taken up by the crop in the 30 days after sowing, which basically means that if you have large amounts of nitrogen in the soil from a pre-plant application during that first 30-day period, that nitrogen is going to be at significant risk of leaching or denitrification loss. If we think about when we might apply nitrogen to take advantage of these uptake patterns and rates, it would suggest that nitrogen fertiliser would be best applied at around 25 days after sowing so that it can convert and become available to the crop from 30 to 35 days onwards. He also found, though, that applying fertiliser after 60 days could delay maturity. So the window of opportunity is somewhat narrow, and it doesn't suggest that all of that fertiliser needs to be applied on day 25, but you sort of have a window from about 25 days after sowing to about 60 days after sowing to get the targeted amount of nitrogen applied to that field in a plant available form so the plant can make use of it during this key period. The challenge, of course, with this approach is how do you actually apply the nitrogen in crop between about that day 25 and day 60 and be able to traffic the field and get nitrogen onto the field and then into the soil in plant available form. And different growers have had different approaches for overcoming this particular difficulty, and it does vary depending on what your environment is and what soil type you have and how trafficable it might be during the wet. In the Burdekin region, a lot of growers found the use of soluble fertilisers such as EZN to be an effective product that they could place onto the soil surface. It's in a form that's not readily volatilised, and then once applied to the surface, it could be incorporated with subsequent rainfall or irrigation. Clearly, putting granular fertiliser in, if you could drill that into the beds, that is somewhat ideal, but certainly not always possible during wet season conditions, which then leaves us with the final option of broadcasting fertiliser onto the soil surface, whether that be through tractor-based equipment or the use of aircraft. So, of course, the in-crop application of fertiliser has its merits, but there's going to be some seasons where it just rains continuously so much that you're unable to get nitrogen onto the field area, or you might be in an environment and on a particular soil type which is just going to make in-field application of nitrogen during the growing season quite difficult. The question is, what other strategies might you be able to use if you're likely to find yourself in that situation? So the ability to traffic fields in crop to apply fertiliser was a real challenge in the river irrigation area of the Burdekin due to their clay soil types. And to address this issue, Steve looked at a number of enhanced efficiency fertiliser options that might delay the release of nitrate from applied fertiliser. In this case, he looked at a urease inhibitor that was called NTEC, together with a polymer-coated form of urea, and compared that with just straight urea applied alone. These products were applied pre-plant, and Steve's looked at the uptake efficiency of these different options. And you can see in the picture there the differences between the 0N, the urea up front, compared with then the polymer and NTEC treatments. And you can see in the table the relative efficiency of uptake of that upfront applied fertiliser with these enhanced efficiency fertiliser options, with the urea over a 3-year period delivering an uptake efficiency of around 26%, compared to the urease inhibitor, which essentially delays the conversion of that applied fertiliser to its nitrate form where it might be then lost from the system. And this increased the uptake efficiency of urea to 37%, to then the polymer coat, which increased uptake efficiency to 53%. Now, the technologies have changed quite a bit since Steve undertook this work 10 to 12 years ago, but the concept around enhanced efficiency fertilizers haven't changed. And there's a number of better products now on the market that will achieve this particular objective and may provide a solution for ensuring that nitrogen is available to the crop in that critical window when the crop needs to be taking it up. If we think, for example, what that might mean for a clay soil type scenario where we don't want to take the risk of being able to make an in-crop application nitrogen, so we want to do a pre-plant only application, and our target yield is 8.5 bales per hectare, we need to achieve a plant uptake of 150 kilograms of nitrogen taken up by that crop per hectare. Now, if we have an assumed contribution from the soil, so that's the background level of nitrogen in that soil type, it's going to contribute about 50 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, which then means that we need to supply an additional 100 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare from the fertilizer that we're applying, which in this case is urea with 46% nitrogen. Now, if we were to use urea on its own as a pre-plant application with the assumed efficiency of 26% that Steve found in his research, this would require us to apply 836 kilograms of applied urea fertilizer product for that pre-plant scenario to have a reasonable chance of having 100 kilograms of nitrogen in the soil and plant available at the time when the crop would be taking that up. If we compared that to one of the urease inhibitors that he used in his experiments that increased that efficiency to 37%, that would reduce the applied urea required to 586 kilograms per hectare, or in the case of the polycoated urea technology, which was found to be a bit more efficient at that point in time, would reduce the amount of urea up front to 410 kilograms per hectare. Now, there's clearly trade-offs associated with these different technologies, and the point I really want to make is that these technologies have really evolved, particularly in the last 5 to 10 years, so there's better products out there. But the trade-off in these situations is obviously the cost of that technology contrasted with the relative increase in efficiency. However, I really wanted to flag that if you're in the scenario where you feel there's a high risk of not being able to split your application, which would give you that efficiency by default, there are these options to delay the release of nitrogen from your applied fertilizer and more or less achieve the same objective, albeit at a higher cost as these products are on cost on top of the fertilizer applied. So one of the key unknowns for a lot of people when they're attempting cotton production for the first time or in their first couple of seasons, whether it be rain-fed or irrigated, is what is the inherent background contribution of nitrogen in your system for your soil type? And this is a critical piece of the puzzle when trying to determine the required rate of fertilizer that you might like to apply. Soil tests are certainly useful, but one of the limitations is that they won't necessarily pick up nitrogen that's bound organically in residues from the previous crop. And the contribution of those residues can be quite significant, as we discovered when cotton was following maize that had been harvested in early December in the Burdekin. That maize trash would return significant quantities of nitrogen to the following cotton crop, often late in February and during March. A nil strip, however, can be used to provide a measure of what the background contribution of nitrogen is from your soil and system. And the use of nil strips over time can help you to build quite a valuable picture of the starting point of the background fertility of your system that will then enable you to estimate fertilizer requirements. Nil strips also provide an indirect measure of the impact for your applied fertilizer. And it's my view that everyone should have a nil strip in Northern Australia, particularly during the first years. They're simple enough to implement. All that's required is something that is of a sizable enough area that when you run a round bale picker over it, you can get an indication of the yield potential of that particular area from the yield monitor or perhaps the module that was produced off that small area. What I've not covered in this webinar is the impact of potential soil constraints, which can complicate nitrogen management and undermine some of the relationships that I've outlined so far. Compaction layers or soils that have poor structure and readily waterlog will impede root development, which can then directly limit the capacity for a crop to take up nutrients. For example, placing nitrogen fertilizer too deeply in soils that have poor airfield porosity may result in the roots being unable to access nitrogen during the wet season. Cotton roots will largely remain within the more oxygenated layers of the soil nearer to the surface. On heavy soils, roots can be limited to the top 10 to 15 centimetres during the wet season. Secondly, in some regions, particularly in the Northern Territory, some soil types have a low pH of around 6 or below, and this soil acidity, depending on its severity, can also become an impediment for the uptake of nitrogen and other nutrients. These soils can also be prone to further acidification through the use of nitrogenous fertilisers, particularly if those fertilisers are leached from the profile. The impact of soil pH for cotton production is therefore likely to be a focus for some regions. So thinking about take-home messages for nitrogen management in Australia's tropics. The first is that there's likely to be a reliable relationship between the uptake of nitrogen and bales of lint cotton produced. In the Burdekin, this was found to be around 18 kilograms of nitrogen to every lint bale produced. Research has been undertaken in other areas, such as the Ord in Western Australia by Jack Daniels from NACRA, which may in fact identify a slightly different relationship for those regions, but that data will become available in due course. Once the crop uptake exceeds 200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, the conversion ratio for additional nitrogen taken up by the crop and the conversion of that to yield is likely to become less efficient. Ideally, the availability of soil nitrate to the crop from the soil should coincide with the period between 30 days after sowing, first square, and 90 days after sowing, which is around cutout. High losses of applied nitrogen can occur particularly in that first 30 days after planting due to the crop's inability to take up nitrogen during those early phases and the high risk of rainfall causing leaching or denitrification losses in that period. So if your strategy for improving nitrogen use efficiency is centred around the in-crop use of fertiliser, that fertiliser is best applied between 25 and 50 days after sowing. And what this will do is ensure that the mineralisation of that fertiliser occurs in time for that key crop uptake period between 30 and 90 days after sowing. Enhanced efficiency fertilisers are also an effective tool for delaying the mineralisation of fertiliser and increasing the uptake efficiency where fertilisers are applied pre-plant. This can be a really valid tool to help you overcome difficulties with trafficking clay soils during the wet season, or where there's forecasts that might indicate a wetter than average wet season that might challenge your ability to make effective in-crop applications of nitrogen. And the key point to make is the technology in this space is constantly evolving, but the science behind how these technologies work has been well demonstrated. So I really hope that you've found today's webinar informative and that you can use some of what you've learnt today to improve nitrogen management on your property. I'd like to acknowledge a number of growers who have assisted with the research over many years across a number of different locations in Northern Australia. And I specifically want to give a shout out to a colleague of mine, Dr. Stephen Yates with the CSIRO, who has done a lot of research on tropical cotton production in Northern Australia, and in particular did a lot of the research on nitrogen management that I've shared with you today. Also want to thank a whole range of technical staff across a number of different organisations, as well as key industry collaborators across various projects. Much of the research that you've seen in this webinar today was funded by the Cotton Research and Development Corporation, as well as previous cotton CRCs, and that work is ongoing today through financial support from the CRC for Developing Northern Australia, which is part of the Australian Government's Cooperative Research Centre program. Thank you.